Hey guys, tonight we settle into the soft glow of a Victorian parlor, where gas lamps flicker and the faint scent of boiled water steeping with herbs drifts through the air. You trudge through the thick fog of widespread insomnia plaguing the 19th century, a world before blue light glasses and white noise apps. Back then, sleep was more elusive than a polite social conversation without a slip of the tongue. You probably won't survive the restless nights of Victorian England, where tired eyes met the dawn far too often. But don't worry, you're not alone. The Victorians wrestled with sleeplessness in ways both familiar and delightfully quirky. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop your location and local time in the comments? I'm always curious where in the world my fellow night owls are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You begin in the early Victorian era, when insomnia, or as they sometimes called it, wakefulness, was an almost universal complaint. Urbanization had transformed England. Smoky chimneys, gas-lit streets, and a bustling factory rhythm had replaced the old countryside's natural lulls. The result? Sleeplessness was as common as afternoon tea, and doctors lamented that city folk were often worn to shadows by nights spent staring at ceiling cracks. Sleep troubles weren't just for the poor either. The middle and upper classes were equally vulnerable, haunted by the stresses of industrial life, social expectations, and the relentless ticking of progress. Victorian newspapers frequently ran advice columns offering remedies, and pharmacies stocked tinctures and powders promising sweet slumber. But amidst all this, one remedy quietly began to capture imaginations and taste buds alike: tea. Before you imagine a cup of strong black tea powering restless energy, remember this was not just any tea. The Victorians were experimenting, mixing delicate herbal blends meant specifically to soothe frazzled nerves. They believed that calming the mind with warm, gentle rituals was as important as the ingredients themselves. Historians still argue whether Victorian insomnia was caused mainly by lifestyle changes, medical conditions, or social anxieties. Some suggest that the rapid urban growth disrupted natural circadian rhythms, while others point to caffeine's increasing presence, even if its effects weren't fully understood yet. It's also worth noting a quirky fringe belief of the time. Some Victorian pamphlets recommended sleeping with a small bottle of essence of lavender under your pillow, or even placing dried hops inside your nightcap to lull you into dreams. You might chuckle at these quaint practices now, but for those desperate for rest, they offered a sliver of hope. So, as you settle in and feel your own eyelids getting heavier, think about how the Victorians, without electric devices or modern medicine, began turning toward warm, fragrant cups to ease the weight of sleeplessness. It's a journey of small comforts and gentle science, wrapped in steam and ritual. You follow the rising steam from a freshly poured cup of tea as it weaves its way through Victorian society, transforming from an exotic import into a daily staple embraced by nearly everyone. Tea's journey to British tables was long and winding, fueled by colonial expansion and trade routes threading through Asia to Europe. By the mid-19th century, the British had made tea not just a beverage, but a social ritual, a comfort, and, importantly, a balm against restless nights. Originally reserved for the wealthy elite, tea had by Victorian times trickled down to the burgeoning middle class, who found solace in its calming effects amid the clangor of industrial life. You can almost hear the clink of fine porcelain cups and the murmur of genteel conversation in drawing rooms across England. The gentle act of brewing and sipping tea became a momentary escape, a small ceremony to slow time and soothe nerves. What's charmingly odd is how many Victorians believed tea had near magical health properties. Some touted it as a cure-all, from digestive troubles to melancholy and, yes, sleep problems. There was a widespread belief that certain teas could balance the humors of the body, a holdover from older medical traditions still lingering in Victorian minds. Chamomile and lavender infusions, for example, were prized for their soporific qualities, while stronger black teas were thought to invigorate and sharpen the mind. Here's a quirky tidbit. Victorian tea drinkers sometimes added a pinch of ground shells, like crushed oyster or clam shells, to their tea leaves. It sounds bizarre, but the rationale was to soften the water and improve digestion, an early version of water treatment of sorts. You wouldn't want to sip that now, but back then it was considered a mark of a knowledgeable host. The rise of tea also dovetailed with growing concerns over water safety. With urban water supplies often contaminated, boiling water for tea served a dual purpose. It made the water safe and provided a comforting ritual that soothed the day's worries. Historians still argue whether this practical aspect was the main driver behind tea's popularity, or if the social and psychological comforts played a bigger role. Socially, tea became more than a drink. It was a way to connect, to slow down, and, crucially, to relax. The very act of taking tea invited a pause in the day's chaos, a gentle lull before evening's quiet. You can picture Victorian families gathering, the aroma of bergamot or chamomile weaving through the air, as talk drifted lazily from politics to poetry. What's fascinating is how this cultural embrace of tea foreshadowed modern ideas of mindful rituals. The Victorians didn't have mindfulness apps, but their afternoon tea ceremonies carried a similar intent: to ground the mind, to connect body and spirit through calm repetition. So as you cradle your own warm cup, real or imagined, consider how Victorian Britain's love affair with tea was about more than taste. It was a soothing balm for the restless soul, a social anchor, and a subtle way to fight insomnia, one sip at a time. You lean in closer now, inhaling the gentle steam, as you discover the Victorian art of herbal tea blending, a subtle science passed down through handwritten recipe books and whispered from one curious hand to another. These blends were more than flavor experiments. They were crafted as delicate potions meant to coax the mind away from the tangled worries of the day toward the quiet embrace of sleep. Chamomile is the reigning queen of Victorian sleep herbs, favored for its soft, apple-like aroma and calming properties. You might imagine Victorian ladies steeping chamomile petals in a dainty teacup, the golden liquid glowing in the lamplight, promising relief from restless nights. But chamomile was far from the only player. Lavender, with its sweet floral notes, was often added to the mix, lending both scent and soothing magic. The Victorians also treasured hops, not just for beer brewing, but as a sleep aid. Dried hops tucked into pillows were a common practice, intended to lull sleepers gently into dreamland. A quirky Victorian habit involved infusing tea with catnip, believed to calm the nerves and promote sleep. You might smile at the idea, but remember that catnip's mild sedative effects have been known for centuries, even if today we mostly associate it with feline frenzy. Victorian herbalists also experimented with valerian root, a herb with a strong, earthy aroma that some found effective, but others described as somewhat pungent, let's say. It was the herbal equivalent of an acquired taste, effective but not for everyone's bedside table. This raises an interesting scholarly debate. Historians and medical experts still argue whether these herbal blends genuinely improved sleep quality or if their benefits were primarily placebo, wrapped in the comforting warmth and ritual of tea drinking. Some contend that the slow, mindful act of brewing and sipping the tea did more to calm the mind than the herbs themselves. Victorians weren't shy about mixing tradition with innovation. Alongside herbal blends, some recipes called for the addition of sleep drops, tinctures made from mixtures of herbs soaked in alcohol or vinegar. These were administered with care, sometimes added to a cup of warm tea before bedtime. Though mildly effective, these remedies reveal a society eager to experiment with both folk wisdom and emerging medical science. Sleep hygiene, as we call it today, was a loosely defined concept then. But Victorian tea rituals often included recommendations to avoid heavy meals or strenuous activities late in the day. They also emphasized the importance of winding down with a gentle cup rather than anything too stimulating. Oddly enough, some teas contained caffeine, but its presence was sometimes overlooked or misunderstood. The calming ritual trumped the stimulant effects, at least in popular belief. So, as you cradle your imaginary cup of chamomile lavender blend, think about how these Victorian concoctions were less about exact science and more about creating moments of calm, sensory comfort, and hope. You're not just drinking tea, you're sipping centuries of slow, thoughtful attempts to wrestle sleep from the grasp of wakefulness. You slip quietly into a cozy Victorian afternoon where the ritual of tea is more than just a beverage, it's a carefully choreographed social pause designed to calm restless minds and steady fluttering hearts. Picture yourself seated by a lace-curtained window, sunlight filtering through, casting soft patterns on the polished wood table, where a delicate porcelain tea set waits patiently. This ritual, known widely as afternoon tea, was an invention of social grace and gentle repose. The ritual began in the early 1840s, credited to Anna, the Duchess of Bedford, who found herself plagued by the dreadful sinking feeling mid-afternoon. She started inviting friends to join her for light snacks and tea, and before long, this became a widespread practice among the Victorian upper classes. For those suffering from insomnia, this social pause was as much a medicine as the tea itself, an intentional slowing of the day's pace to soothe overworked nerves. You might imagine the calm chatter and polite laughter, the clink of teaspoons against fine china, and the faint aroma of Earl Grey mingling with the scent of freshly baked scones. The Victorian tea table was laden with finger sandwiches, pastries, and, crucially, a selection of teas brewed precisely to relax. Chamomile and other herbal infusions often featured, served alongside the more common black teas. An amusing Victorian tea etiquette rule dictated that one must always stir tea 3 times clockwise to avoid bad luck. Yes, even superstition found a place here. And woe betide anyone who neglected to hold their pinky finger gracefully while sipping. Though, ironically, historians still debate whether the pinky extension was a sign of refinement or simply a practical way to balance the delicate porcelain cups. The social aspect of afternoon tea was crucial for those battling insomnia. It offered a gentle distraction from the anxieties that often fueled sleepless nights. Gathering in well-lit rooms, sharing stories or poetry, allowed the mind to settle slowly, making the eventual retreat to bed a more peaceful transition. Victorian doctors occasionally recommended afternoon tea breaks as part of nervous health treatments, though they warned against overindulgence in caffeinated varieties later in the day. The tea ritual itself, with its structured pauses and sensory pleasures, embodied a proto-mindfulness practice, centering attention on warmth, taste, and companionship. So, as you imagine yourself partaking in a quiet afternoon tea, feel the slow rhythm of clinking cups and low voices gently washing over you. This ritual wasn't just about tea. It was a carefully crafted lullaby for a society learning how to soften the edges of an increasingly hectic world. You settle deeper into the Victorian bedroom, a sanctum far removed from the bustling streets outside, designed with both comfort and restfulness in mind. Here, the Victorians took their quest for better sleep seriously, shaping bedrooms and nightly habits to invite slumber rather than chase it away. Imagine heavy drapes drawn against the chill, a bed with a canopy to trap warmth, and a faint scent of lavender hanging in the air, an olfactory cue to soothe the restless mind. Victorian bedrooms were often decorated to reflect wealth and taste, but beyond the opulence, there was a practical aim: to create an environment conducive to sleep. Thick curtains blocked out street lamps and early morning light, while heavy quilts and feather beds provided warmth against cold, drafty houses. People believed that fresh air was vital but also dangerous, so windows were typically opened slightly before bedtime and then closed tight to prevent chill during the night. Hygiene was a growing concern too. Bathing before bed was encouraged as a way to relax muscles and calm nerves, though some debated the ideal temperature and timing. Hot water bottles or warming pans were placed in beds to stave off the cold, creating cozy microclimates that invited dozing off. Some even used perfumed sachets filled with herbs like rosemary or hops to scent their linens. But the bedroom was more than just a place. It was a stage for Victorian sleep habits, many of which seem odd today. For instance, a popular practice was segmented sleep, where people slept in two distinct phases through the night, waking for an hour or two in between. During this time, they might read, write letters, or enjoy a quiet cup of tea before returning to bed for the second half of their rest. Historians still argue whether this was a natural sleep pattern or a cultural response to the era's anxieties and demands. Your mind might wander to the curious devices that lined some Victorian bedrooms. Music boxes or mechanical toys played lullabies, while soft lamps cast gentle shadows. Some believed that sound and light played a role in easing the transition from wakefulness to sleep. Others recommended reading aloud poetry or reciting prayers as a mental warm-up, similar to modern bedtime rituals. And here's a delightful fringe belief. Some Victorians thought that sleeping with a piece of coral or a small mirror under the pillow could ward off bad dreams or restless spirits. These charms, a mixture of superstition and folk wisdom, reveal a society eager to soothe the mind from all angles. As you imagine sinking into one of these beds, wrapped in layers of warmth and surrounded by these gentle rituals, it's clear the Victorians sought not just sleep, but sanctuary. Their bedrooms were carefully curated spaces where every detail, from temperature to scent, played a role in coaxing the weary into rest. You're now leaning into a cup of Victorian curiosity about caffeine, an ingredient that confounds as much as it comforts. It's a strange dance. On one hand, tea was celebrated for its calming properties. On the other, its caffeine content was suspected to stir the mind just when it ought to be settling down. You imagine the puzzled faces of Victorians trying to reconcile these contradictory effects, like trying to nap next to a roaring campfire. By the mid-19th century, caffeine's role in sleep was not fully understood. Some doctors cautioned against late-day consumption of strong black teas, warning it could provoke wakefulness or nervous excitement. Yet, countless others believed that the ritual of tea, brewing, steeping, and sipping, was soothing enough to overcome any stimulant effects. One amusing Victorian belief was that tea's caffeine actually had a paradoxical calming effect, much like how some people today swear coffee helps them relax. It wasn't unusual to find prescriptions recommending small quantities of tea to the sleep-deprived, especially when combined with calming herbs like lavender or valerian. The idea was that caffeine sharpened the mind during the day, but faded harmlessly by bedtime. Here's a quirky tidbit. Victorian socialites sometimes engaged in tea duels, hour-long competitions to see who could sip tea the slowest without dropping the cup. It was partly a show of refinement, but also an odd way to pace caffeine intake and avoid jittery nerves. You might chuckle imagining these high-society slow sippers trying not to twitch from caffeine withdrawal or excess. Historians still argue whether Victorian society's caffeine consumption was a main driver of insomnia or if other factors like stress and urban noise were more to blame. Some scholars believe that the caffeine content was lower in Victorian teas compared to modern brews, thanks to shorter steep times and looser leaf packs. Others point to the increasing availability of coffee, chocolate, and other stimulants muddying the picture. This caffeine conundrum extends to children, too. Victorian parents were advised to avoid giving their little ones tea after midday, yet the occasional weak tea was often served to calm restless children, a practice that raises eyebrows today. It was a delicate balance, trying to harness tea's comforting warmth without stirring the spirits awake. As you imagine Victorian families navigating these caffeine puzzles, you can almost feel the tension between tradition and emerging science, between comfort and caution. The humble cup of tea was both a soothing friend and a mysterious stimulant, a dual-edged sword in the battle against insomnia. So next time you sip your evening tea, consider that you're participating in a centuries-old dance between relaxation and alertness, a dance the Victorians knew all too well. You now step into the softly lit corners of Victorian homes, where tea wasn't the only lullaby for weary minds. Beyond the familiar warmth of a teacup, Victorians explored an array of gentle sleep aids, blending emerging technology with tender traditions in an attempt to tame insomnia's grip. Imagine the delicate tick and whirl of a music box nestled on a bedside table, its tiny gears coaxing out a lullaby that softly fills the room. These charming devices were more than child's play. Many adults swore by their soothing melodies as a gentle nudge toward sleep. The Victorians believed sound could guide the mind from the day's worries into restful surrender. You can almost picture a tired hand winding the key, hoping the mechanical tune will outlast the restless thoughts. Besides music boxes, you encounter aromatic sleep pillows, little sachets stuffed with hops, lavender, or valerian, placed beneath the head or even worn as nightcaps. These tactile, scented comforts were thought to envelop the sleeper in a cocoon of calm. Some even took to gently massaging chamomile oil into their temples before bed, a ritual combining scent, touch, and intention. A more curious Victorian sleep aid was the use of sleeping draughts, tinctures made from mild sedatives like laudanum or other opium-based preparations. While these were effective in encouraging sleep, their use was controversial, sometimes leading to dependency. Historians still debate whether the widespread use of such substances helped more than they harmed, especially given limited medical oversight. Victorian inventors also toyed with early mechanical devices designed to promote rest. One such oddity was the sleeping machine, a contraption involving rocking chairs and gentle vibrations aimed at lulling the body into relaxation. It sounds like the great-grandparent of modern massage chairs, though with more creaks and mysterious springs. Interestingly, some Victorian physicians prescribed routine evening walks in the fresh air as a natural sleep aid, echoing a timeless wisdom that movement and nature help calm the mind. Yet these walks were best done well before nightfall. Later hours were believed to stir the spirits or invite unwelcome chills. You might smile to learn that one fringe Victorian idea involved placing a bowl of warm milk and a pinch of ground nutmeg by the bedside, a comforting potion believed to ease the body and mind. Though today we might dismiss this as a quaint folk remedy, the underlying principle, comforting the senses, remains surprisingly modern. As you picture these varied Victorian sleep aids, the tinkling music box, fragrant pillows, gentle strolls, you realize that insomnia was battled on many fronts. The combination of sound, scent, movement, and ritual created a tapestry of gentle comforts designed to coax even the most restless into the embrace of sleep. You drift now into the Victorian medical world, where doctors, dressed in waistcoats and spectacles, grappled with understanding the mysterious beast that was insomnia. Their explanations, while earnest, often mixed established science with lingering ancient beliefs, creating a landscape both fascinating and perplexing. Victorian physicians largely believed that insomnia was caused by a delicate imbalance in the nervous system, sometimes called nervous exhaustion or neurasthenia. The fast pace of modern life, industrial noise, and even excessive thinking were blamed for the overstimulation that kept the mind racing when the body begged for rest. In their eyes, the brain needed soothing, and tea, with its gentle warmth and herbal qualities, was a natural ally. Doctors often recommended warm, non-stimulating drinks before bed, sometimes prescribing teas infused with valerian, hops, or chamomile. They believed these herbs acted as sedatives, calming the nerves and allowing sleep to arrive naturally. There was also a growing acceptance that the ritual of drinking tea, taking time to prepare and sip, played a therapeutic role by slowing the mind's pace. Yet not all doctors agreed. Some were skeptical of tea's effects, cautioning against its caffeine content and preferring remedies like warm baths, light exercises, or even electrical therapies, which were experimental but gaining popularity. Electrical stimulation via devices like Faraday machines was used to invigorate the nerves or calm excitability, though you can imagine how odd it must have felt to patients lying in contraptions buzzing quietly beside their beds. One particularly fringe medical theory posited that certain insomnia sufferers suffered from brain congestion, a vague term for what we might now call migraines or anxiety disorders. The treatment often involved purgatives or bloodletting, which in hindsight seem harsh compared to the calming cup of tea. Historians still argue how effective or harmful these practices truly were. Doctors also recognized the importance of sleep environment, recommending well-ventilated rooms without excessive noise or light. Many suggested strict bedtime routines, including the timing of tea consumption, to avoid caffeine interfering with rest. The balance was delicate. Too much tea, and you risked restlessness. Too little, and the soothing ritual was lost. A quirky side note, some Victorian medical manuals advised patients to avoid reading in bed or discussing stressful topics before sleep, advice that sounds surprisingly modern. Instead, they encouraged reading light poetry or listening to calming music, reinforcing the idea that mental calm was essential for sleep. As you imagine Victorian doctors debating over tea, you sense their genuine desire to understand insomnia, though their tools and knowledge were limited. Their embrace of tea and herbal blends wasn't just habit, but a thoughtful attempt to align science, tradition, and patient comfort. So, while some treatments might raise eyebrows today, the underlying Victorian wisdom that calming rituals and gentle herbal remedies could ease the nervous mind still resonates, steeped in steam and hope. You now find yourself among the quieter corners of Victorian tea culture, where social anxieties and odd superstitions bubbled beneath polite conversation. Tea, after all, was as much about the ritual and rules as it was about the drink itself, especially for those prone to nervousness or sleeplessness. One charming Victorian superstition held that stirring your tea clockwise 3 times would ward off bad luck, while stirring counterclockwise invited it in. You can almost picture guests at a drawing room hesitating before their spoons, calculating the right number of twirls to keep ill fortune at bay. It was a small, gentle way of exerting control in an unpredictable world, a ritual that soothed minds, even if it had no scientific grounding. Tea etiquette was equally important. Lifting the pinky finger while sipping was less about aristocratic airs and more a practical balance act, though plenty of Victorian caricatures made fun of it. Historians still argue whether these gestures were originally signs of refinement or simply a way to keep tiny, fragile porcelain cups steady. Either way, the performance mattered, especially for those prone to social jitters that could keep sleep at bay. You might chuckle to learn that some Victorians believed tea leaves could reveal future fortunes. The art of tasseography, reading tea leaves, became a popular parlor pastime, offering a whimsical distraction for restless minds. While not everyone took it seriously, the ritual of peering into a cup was a moment of focused calm, a quiet meditation on possibilities. Another quirky practice was silent tea, where guests sipped in contemplative quiet, allowing the mind to settle as much as the tongue.
This practice was thought to help calm the nervous system and prepare one for a restful night. It's easy to see how these social customs weren't just manners, but subtle ways to cultivate mental peace. Victorian humor also poked gentle fun at tea culture. Caricatures often depicted frazzled ladies and gentlemen who'd spill tea in their haste to keep up appearances, or tea rooms where nervous laughter was louder than the clink of cups. These moments of levity remind you that beneath the stiff collars and prim gloves, Victorians were just as human and just as prone to anxiety as anyone else. As you imagine yourself navigating these tea rituals, you begin to understand how tea culture was more than caffeine or herbs. It was a slow, sensory embrace of calm, laced with superstition and social grace. These customs, no matter how quirky, shaped a culture's approach to soothing the restless mind. So, whether stirring clockwise or enjoying silent tea, Victorian rituals offered gentle anchors in a world too fast and too loud, inviting even the most anxious souls to pause, breathe, and, hopefully, sleep.
You now find yourself nestled within the nuanced intersections of Victorian tea rituals and the delicate tapestry of gender roles and women's health. In a society governed by strict codes of conduct and defined social expectations, tea drinking was more than a soothing pastime. It became a subtle form of self-care and social agency for many women. Victorian women were often portrayed as the fragile angels in the house, prone to what doctors called hysteria or nervous ailments, terms that today might sound outdated or overly simplistic. Yet, these diagnoses reflected genuine experiences of anxiety, fatigue, and sleeplessness. Tea, especially calming herbal blends, became a quiet refuge, a way for women to reclaim moments of calm in the midst of rigid domestic expectations. Imagine a lady in a corseted gown settling into a plush armchair with a warm cup of chamomile or lavender tea. This simple act was both restorative and, in some ways, rebellious, a gentle refusal to be entirely consumed by endless chores or social performances. Tea breaks provided socially acceptable pauses, moments to nurture both body and spirit. There was even a belief that certain teas could alleviate female troubles, a catch-all phrase encompassing menstrual discomfort, mood swings, and the ever-mysterious nervousness. Ingredients like raspberry leaf or peppermint were prized for their supposed balancing effects on women's health, making tea a herbal ally in a world with limited medical options for female well-being. You might smile at the image of women gathering in tea circles, exchanging gossip, poems, or advice, creating communities bound by shared rituals and secrets. These gatherings offered social support, a vital counterbalance to isolation or anxiety, and a chance to discuss anxieties, sometimes even insomnia, openly. Historians still debate how much agency women truly had within these tea rituals, given the broader constraints of Victorian society. Some argue that tea culture reinforced gender norms, emphasizing delicate femininity and domesticity. Others see it as a subtle form of empowerment, where women carved out sacred spaces for rest and camaraderie. A quirky Victorian practice involved serving tea cakes or light pastries, designed to be easy on digestion, reflecting the era's emphasis on gentle nourishment for the delicate constitution. The ritual of selecting and savoring these treats was as much about sensory pleasure as physical sustenance. As you imagine these scenes, you begin to appreciate how tea was intertwined with women's health and social roles, a balm for the body and a balm for the soul. It was a gentle rebellion wrapped in lace and steam, a quiet way to soothe nerves and claim moments of peace. So, when you next cradle a warm cup, think of those Victorian women who, amid corsets and candlelight, found in tea a soft refuge from their restless minds and demanding worlds.
You now find yourself wandering through the pages of Victorian literature, where insomnia and sleep troubles are woven like threads into the fabric of novels and poetry. Writers of the era often reflected society's preoccupations with restlessness, nervousness, and the search for calm in a rapidly changing world. Their words provide an intimate glimpse into how Victorians perceived and experienced sleeplessness. Picture a dimly lit Victorian parlor, the fireplace crackling softly, as you listen to characters in novels wrestle with midnight thoughts and haunting anxieties. Authors like Charles Dickens and the Bronte sisters often depicted restless nights not just as physical struggles, but as metaphors for social and emotional turmoil. You might recall the vivid descriptions of insomnia as a ghostly companion or silent tormentor, familiar to many readers then and now. Poetry, too, was a refuge. Verses about tranquil nights, gentle dreams, or the elusive embrace of sleep circulated widely. Some poems read almost like lullabies, comforting the weary, or acknowledging the shared human condition of wakefulness. Imagine Victorian poets writing by candlelight, hoping their words would soothe themselves and their readers. A curious Victorian pastime was reading aloud in bed, often from light-hearted or romantic works to calm the mind. However, it was advised to avoid dense or disturbing texts that might fuel the restless imagination, a surprisingly modern piece of advice. Historians still argue how much these literary practices actually aided sleep or simply reflected cultural attitudes toward rest. One fringe literary habit was dream journaling, where some Victorians recorded their nocturnal visions and musings. While not widespread, this practice reveals an early fascination with the mind's nighttime wanderings and a desire to make sense of restless nights. Humor found its place too, with satirical poems and stories gently mocking the nervous Victorians who fretted over every missed minute of sleep. These light jabs reminded readers not to take sleeplessness too seriously, a welcome reprieve from the era's often heavy moral tone. As you imagine yourself nestled among these literary whispers, you sense a culture seeking solace in words as much as in warm tea. Stories and poems became companions for the sleepless, softening the edges of night and offering shared understanding. So, as your own eyes grow heavy, remember that the Victorians found comfort not only in cups of tea, but also in the gentle embrace of stories, words weaving a quiet path toward restful dreams. You lean in closer to the fragrant steam of Victorian teapots as they brewed not just common black tea, but a curious array of alternative ingredients, each selected for its supposed calming or medicinal powers. These less common additives reveal a Victorian willingness to experiment with nature's bounty in the quest for restful nights. Lavender, already a favorite for its floral scent, was often mixed into blends, lending both fragrance and gentle sedative effects. You might imagine delicate purple blossoms floating in warm water, the aroma filling a quiet room. Alongside lavender, rose petals added a subtle sweetness and romantic allure, believed to calm the heart and nerves alike. Then there's the unexpected. Mugwort, a bitter herb more commonly associated with folklore and dream magic, found its way into some Victorian blends. Thought to encourage vivid dreams and restful sleep, mugwort teas were a fringe favorite, part herbal remedy, part mystical experiment. You can almost see a curious Victorian herbalist stirring a pot, hoping to glimpse a better dreamscape. Another surprising ingredient was catnip, once more a friend to the feline world than humans, but in Victorian times it was taken seriously as a mild relaxant. Its use was thought to soothe digestive troubles and nervous tension, making it a popular choice for those troubled by restless nights. Historians still debate how much these alternative ingredients genuinely aided sleep versus providing psychological comfort through ritual and belief. Some argue that the herbal combinations' effects were subtle but real, while others see them mainly as soothing distractions, helping people focus on calm rather than worry. A curious Victorian anecdote tells of sleeping teas sold in apothecaries, containing a mix of herbs and sometimes mild opiates, though the latter were kept discreet due to their addictive potential. These blends reflect the era's delicate balance between folk tradition and emerging pharmaceutical science. Imagine the ritual of selecting these ingredients, measuring precise pinches, and steeping them with care. The act itself, the scent, warmth, and slow pace, was part of what made these teas effective in calming the restless mind. So, as you picture yourself sipping a Victorian herbal blend infused with lavender, rose, or perhaps even mugwort, know that you're sharing a moment with countless others who sought solace in nature's gentle remedies, hoping that each fragrant cup would carry them closer to peaceful sleep. You step now into the bustling streets and cozy parlors where Victorian entrepreneurs saw opportunity in sleep itself. The rise of commercial sleep teas was a fascinating chapter, blending the era's herbal traditions with the dawn of mass marketing. You can almost hear the clatter of shopkeepers setting out jars labeled nervous relief or sleepy time blend, their scents mingling in the air like promises of calm. These early branded teas often combined familiar herbs, chamomile, valerian, hops, with exotic spices like cinnamon or cardamom, creating blends that promised more than taste, a ticket to restful nights. Packaging was ornate, with flowing script and delicate illustrations of sleeping cherubs or moonlit landscapes, designed to catch the eye and soothe the soul before the first sip. A quirky fact, some sleep teas claim to be scientifically formulated, boasting endorsements from doctors or testimonials from famous figures, though modern historians often question the validity of these claims. These marketing tactics reveal a society eager to blend tradition with the new science of medicine and consumerism. The commercialization of sleep aids also meant that sleep teas became widely available beyond the elite drawing rooms, reaching the growing middle class who battled city noise, long working hours, and their own restless minds. Apothecaries and grocers alike stocked these blends, making them accessible comforts for many. Historians still debate how much the marketing hype influenced Victorian consumers versus genuine belief in these products' efficacy. Some argue that the ritual of buying and preparing these teas was as therapeutic as the ingredients, offering psychological reassurance in uncertain times. This rise of branded sleep teas foreshadowed modern wellness trends, where comfort and marketing intertwine. Victorian consumers, much like today's, sought not just products but experiences, rituals wrapped in promise and familiarity. So, as you imagine browsing a Victorian apothecary, inhaling the mingling scents of herbs and spices, you're witnessing an early form of wellness culture, where tea was both tradition and innovation, a small bottle of hope on a crowded shelf.
You now drift toward the curious crossroads where Victorian beliefs about tea and sleep meet modern scientific scrutiny. As you cradle your imagined cup, it's tempting to see Victorian tea rituals as quaint or purely cultural. But beneath the lace and steam lies a complex dialogue between tradition and emerging science. Modern sleep researchers acknowledge that the warm ritual of tea drinking can indeed promote relaxation and signal the body to unwind. The gentle warmth, soothing scents, and mindful pacing of preparation all engage the parasympathetic nervous system, nudging the body toward calm. In this way, Victorian tea rituals anticipated modern concepts of behavioral sleep hygiene. Yet historians and scientists still debate how much the herbs themselves, like chamomile or valerian, actually affect sleep quality. Some studies suggest mild sedative properties, while others attribute benefits largely to placebo effects or the context of ritual. Victorian confidence in these remedies, though lacking today's rigorous trials, was grounded in centuries of folk wisdom. A fascinating modern twist is the growing interest in mindful tea drinking as a form of meditation. The Victorians unknowingly practiced a version of this, using tea as a tool to center attention and calm the mind, much like today's mindfulness apps. On the other hand, some Victorian beliefs, like the notion that certain teas could balance bodily humors or directly alter nervous energies, have been debunked or transformed with modern neuroscience. The caffeine conundrum remains. While some Victorian teas contained caffeine, their overall consumption patterns and preparation methods might have moderated its stimulating effects. A quirky modern comparison lies in the resurgence of herbal sleep teas marketed today, often echoing Victorian blends. It raises the question, how much are we repeating history, and how much are we rediscovering ancient wisdom? Historians still argue whether Victorian tea rituals were primarily social performances or genuinely effective sleep aids, or perhaps a little bit of both. The answer might lie in the interplay of mind, body, and culture, a complex dance as old as tea itself. So as you sip your own cup, know that you're part of a continuum, linking Victorian hopes and rituals to today's quest for restful sleep, a timeless pursuit wrapped in steam and gentle ceremony. You arrive now at the subtle echoes of Victorian tea rituals still present in our modern ideas of sleep and relaxation. Though the corsets and gas lamps have faded, the gentle art of winding down with a warm cup remains a beloved balm for restless minds across generations. Consider how today's bedtime teas, with their carefully blended chamomile, lavender, and valerian, owe much to Victorian experiments and traditions. Their rituals, brewing, steeping, and savoring, offer more than flavor. They invite mindfulness, calm, and connection to centuries-old practices. Victorian emphasis on environment, from dimmed lights to quiet rooms scented with herbs, anticipated modern sleep hygiene advice. The segmented sleep patterns, once common, hint at how our understanding of rest is still evolving. And that delicate balance between caffeine's stimulation and tea's comfort continues to puzzle and intrigue. You might smile knowing that the quaint superstitions, social etiquette, and curious herbal concoctions of the Victorians persist as charming footnotes in our cultural memory, reminding us that the quest for good sleep is as human as breath. Historians still debate how much Victorian tea rituals actually cured insomnia versus simply soothing it. Perhaps the true power lay in the rituals themselves, the slow, intentional moments that calmed the mind and signaled rest was near. So, as you prepare to close your eyes, let the steam from your cup carry the whispers of Victorian evenings. Soft clinks of china, the hush of polite conversation, the gentle weight of a lace tablecloth. Let it remind you that across centuries we share the same simple hope, to find peace in the quiet and comfort in the ritual.
Hey guys, tonight we dive into Victorian tea rituals, how sipping shaped sleepy evenings and sometimes cured insomnia, though you probably won't survive this dry history lesson without dozing off. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a cozy Victorian parlor, the faint smell of freshly brewed tea curling through the air like a gentle mist. A delicate china teacup warms your hands, the steam drifting lazily upward, blending with the soft flicker of candlelight. Outside, gas lamps cast a mellow glow on cobblestone streets as the day surrenders to twilight. This is the world where tea was more than a drink. It was a ritual, a soothing balm against the anxieties and restless nights that plagued the Victorian soul. Tea's journey to this moment is a winding one. Imported from far-flung China centuries earlier, tea had once been an exotic luxury reserved for nobility. But by the 19th century, thanks to colonial trade and booming global commerce, it became the centerpiece of daily life for many in Britain.
The Victorian era, with its strict social codes and rapid industrialization, elevated tea drinking from a mere beverage to an elaborate ceremony. You can almost hear the clink of porcelain, the murmur of polite conversation, and feel the collective sigh of a society trying desperately to find calm amid change. Yet, for all its comforting charms, tea was a curious paradox in the Victorian bedroom. While some swore by its gentle warmth to lull them into sleep, others blamed it for keeping them tossing and turning until dawn. Insomnia, that age-old adversary, was not just a medical issue but a social one, wrapped up in the era's complex relationship with health, propriety, and even morality. Historians still argue whether Victorian tea truly helped ease sleeplessness or simply masked deeper anxieties with a pleasant distraction. Tonight, you'll wander through these paradoxes, exploring how Victorian tea rituals tried to tame insomnia, the strange herbs stirred in those cups, the rituals around sipping that might have been just as important as the tea itself, and the legacy left behind for anyone seeking sleep in a cup. So, tuck yourself in a little tighter, and let's start with how this beloved beverage crept its way from China to Victorian England and your bedside table. You trace the roots of Victorian tea culture back to an era when tea was still a mysterious elixir, shipped halfway across the world from the misty hills of China. The British East India Company, that imperial giant, played a starring role, turning tea into a commodity that slipped seamlessly into everyday life. By the early 1800s, tea had become so popular it was as British as foggy mornings and gloomy weather, which is saying something, considering England barely grows tea leaves. Victorians didn't just drink tea, they worshipped it. Tea rooms popped up in cities like mushrooms after rain, and for a moment it felt like the nation collectively agreed that life was simply better with a steaming cup in hand. But what's fascinating, and perhaps a little odd, is how tea infiltrated every layer of society, from the grand drawing rooms of the aristocracy to the modest kitchens of the working class. The ritual became a social equalizer of sorts, a shared habit that both united and divided depending on how fancy your porcelain and how loose your leaves. The tea itself evolved during this time. Loose leaf blends gave way to the more convenient tea bags by the late Victorian period, though purists might gasp at that notion. Blending wasn't just about flavor. It was about health, mood, and sometimes superstition. Victorians believed the right tea blend could calm nerves, aid digestion, and even promote sleep. But they also worried about the opposite, the jittery effects of too much caffeine hiding in their cups. The import of tea from China was a story tangled with cultural misunderstandings. Some Victorians tried to mimic the elaborate Chinese tea ceremonies, but ended up creating something entirely their own, less about spiritual meditation and more about polite socializing, strict etiquette, and the ever-important tea time. Yet the influence of Eastern traditions was undeniable, even if historians still debate how much Victorian tea rituals truly borrowed versus reinvented. One quirky tidbit: early Victorian tea drinkers sometimes used crocodile dung as a sunscreen ingredient, believing it protected their pale complexions while sipping outdoors. It's not related to tea directly, but it speaks volumes about the odd mix of science and superstition swirling in the air during those times. You might want to steer clear of crocodile dung in your skincare, but you can safely stick to tea. By the mid-19th century, tea was no longer just a drink, but a cornerstone of daily life. It punctuated the day, offering moments of respite in a world that was speeding up with industrial progress. Yet, amidst all the pomp and pageantry, the question lingered: did tea actually help the Victorians catch some shut-eye? Or was it just enough excuse to sit quietly and pretend the world wasn't so stressful? You sit down with the Duchess of Bedford in a plush Victorian drawing room and ask, why afternoon tea? The answer isn't just about hunger. It's about a carefully constructed pause in a day that was otherwise endless and, frankly, exhausting.
Anna, the Duchess credited with popularizing afternoon tea in the 1840s, found herself famished between the late lunch and the early dinner. So she began the habit of enjoying a light meal with tea around 4 p.m. This little break grew legs, and soon everyone from London's high society to middle-class parlors was marking their clocks for tea time. But there was more than just food on the table. Afternoon tea became a social performance, an elaborate dance of etiquette, conversation, and, importantly, a chance to slow down. It was a moment to savor delicate sandwiches, scones, and, of course, tea brewed to perfection. The ritual's timing was precise. Not too early to spoil appetite, not too late to interfere with dinner plans. It was a Victorian answer to the modern coffee break, minus the caffeine crash, but with double the manners. This ritual wasn't only about indulgence, it had psychological undertones. The slow sipping, the clinking of fine china, the light chatter all worked as a form of relaxation therapy. Some modern sleep researchers even suggest that such consistent routines before rest can help signal the brain to unwind. Historians still argue whether the Duchess truly intended it as a sleep aid, but it's clear that afternoon tea offered a collective moment of calm in an otherwise fast-paced and rigid society. On the quirkier side, some Victorians took the ritual to literal extremes. There were reports of tea face competitions where ladies would perfect their poised expressions during tea to convey the right mix of pleasure and restraint, because heaven forbid one looked too eager or too bored. The whole event was tightly scripted, like a play where every sip, smile, and slight nod counted. Tea rooms became cultural hubs too. Men and women mingled under the guise of polite conversation, sometimes discussing everything from the latest novel to personal troubles that, ironically, might have kept them awake at night. The socializing aspect is crucial here. It's not just the tea, but the company that mattered. So afternoon tea wasn't simply about sipping a hot drink. It was a complex social mechanism that helped Victorians find brief sanctuary from their anxieties, and maybe even helped prepare the mind for rest. You could say it was the original mindfulness practice, with sandwiches.
You cradle your teacup, feeling the warmth seep into your palms, and wonder, could this ritual really help you sleep? The Victorians themselves wrestled with this question. While tea was adored as a comforting companion to evening hours, some feared it was the very culprit behind their restless nights. It's a paradox that tea, packed with caffeine, was both blamed for insomnia and prescribed as a mild sedative. The caffeine content in Victorian tea wasn't a secret, but knowledge was patchy and often muddled by folklore and anecdote. Some believed black teas were too strong for nighttime drinking, opting instead for delicate green teas or herbal infusions said to soothe the nerves. Chamomile, valerian root, and lavender found their way into teapots alongside traditional tea leaves, forming blends meant to lull the restless to sleep. You might imagine the Victorian equivalent of a sleepy bedtime story being a cup of nettle tea, not a thriller novel. Interestingly, some Victorian doctors recommended tea as a remedy for anxiety and sleeplessness, but others warned of its stimulating effects, especially when consumed late in the day. This medical ambivalence reflects a broader Victorian tension between embracing modernity and clinging to traditional remedies. Historians still argue whether tea's reputed sleep benefits were more placebo than pharmacology. One quirky fact, there were also teas infused with opium or other calming substances, marketed discreetly to ease severe insomnia. Thankfully, these weren't mainstream, but their existence reminds you how far people will go for a good night's rest. You're definitely safer sticking to your chamomile. Socially, tea's role was equally contradictory. Evening tea rituals could foster relaxation and bonding, yet the caffeine might keep sensitive drinkers wired. Some Victorians learned to limit their tea consumption to early afternoon, while others embraced it anytime as a comfort. It was a personal gamble. Drink for solace or risk a night staring at the ceiling. As you sip your tea tonight,
It's worth remembering that the Victorians were just as conflicted about their beloved beverage as you might be about that midnight cup of coffee. Sleep science has since grown clearer, but the debate over tea's sleepy powers lingers. A cozy conundrum wrapped in steam and tradition.
You lie awake, staring at the ceiling, while Victorian society views insomnia through a different lens than your modern self might. Back then, sleeplessness was far more than a personal nuisance. It was a symptom loaded with social and moral meaning. People believed that a good night's sleep was essential not just for health, but for spiritual balance and moral uprightness. To be restless was sometimes interpreted as a sign of weakness, or worse, moral failing. Victorian doctors approached insomnia with a mix of sympathy and suspicion. They saw it as a symptom of nervous disorders, often linked to the stresses of modern life, rapid industrialization, and the strict societal expectations placed on individuals, especially women. In fact, insomnia was often diagnosed as part of a broader condition known as neurasthenia, a catch-all term for anxiety, fatigue, and nervous exhaustion. It's fascinating to note that many Victorian sleep remedies overlapped with treatments for this mysterious ailment. At the same time, Victorian medicine was just beginning to transition from folklore to science, meaning that treatments for insomnia ranged from herbal concoctions and opium-laced tonics to simply recommending more fresh air and less mental stimulation before bed. Yet, despite the contradictions, the importance of rest was universally acknowledged. The middle and upper classes, in particular, were encouraged to cultivate healthy habits to protect their delicate nerves. The cultural pressure to appear composed and industrious by day meant that admitting to insomnia could be socially embarrassing. Women were often advised to take up calming activities like needlework or reading pleasant books in the evening, paired with a cup of tea. For men, late-night ruminations over business or politics were common causes of sleeplessness, with advice leaning towards physical exercise or fresh air walks to tire the body. You might be surprised to learn that Victorian sleep hygiene included bizarre recommendations, like avoiding certain colors in bedrooms or limiting the number of pillows used, a far cry from today's sound machines and blackout curtains. These practices underline how the Victorians blended superstition and emerging science in their quest for rest. Historians still argue whether these attitudes toward insomnia actually helped sufferers or simply stigmatized a common problem. Either way, the Victorian era treated sleeplessness as a complex challenge, entwined with social status, gender roles, and emerging medical thought, a far cry from the casual caffeine jitters you might blame today. You lean closer to your teacup and discover the curious world of Victorian herbal tea blends, those fragrant mixtures that claimed to coax the body and mind toward restful sleep. Unlike the simple black teas that dominated the social scene, these herbal concoctions were like secret potions passed down through generations, some more scientific, others wildly eccentric. Chamomile was a staple, praised for its calming effects and gentle floral aroma. But Victorians didn't stop there. Valerian root, infamous for its pungent smell, found its way into many a sleepy time blend. You'd probably wrinkle your nose at the thought, but for many, valerian was a bedtime hero, easing the nerves after a long day of corsets, candlelight, and social obligations. Then there was lavender, whose sweet scent was said to lull even the most troubled sleeper into dreams. But here's the quirky twist. Victorians also experimented with less conventional ingredients. Hops, better known today as a key beer ingredient, was used in teas for its sedative properties. Skullcap, a plant with a slightly sinister name but a long history in folk medicine, was believed to calm anxiety and promote sleep. Even rose petals made occasional appearances, for their soothing fragrance and subtle mood-lifting qualities. These herbal blends weren't just about flavor. They were about chemistry, perception, and ritual. Brewing and sipping these teas became a kind of bedtime meditation, signaling the body to shift from daytime hustle to night's restorative calm. Some Victorian herbalists claimed that the ritual itself, choosing leaves, steeping water, and slow sipping, was as important as the drink, a concept that modern mindfulness practices have echoed. One particularly strange addition sometimes recommended was catnip, not just for your feline friends. Catnip was believed to have calming effects on humans as well, though the idea of drinking cat tea might make you pause. Then's the curious history of sleep pillows, stuffed with herbs like hops and lavender, placed under pillows or near beds to enhance the calming atmosphere. Historians still argue whether these herbal additions truly had pharmacological effects, or whether much of their power came from Victorian expectations and placebo. Regardless, these mixtures offer a fascinating glimpse into how Victorians blended tradition, nature, and emerging science to tackle the universal problem of insomnia. So, next time you steep your chamomile, remember it's part of a long lineage of sleepy time sips, some fragrant, some pungent, all designed to chase away the sleepless night. You hold your teacup delicately, mindful of the unwritten rules governing every sip. Tea time etiquette was no small matter in Victorian England. It was a carefully choreographed dance, and mastering it could mean the difference between social grace and scandalous faux pas. But beyond social standing, these rituals around tea actually helped Victorians relax and find a quiet moment amid their busy days, even if the tea itself was secretly buzzing with caffeine. First, there was the handling of the cup itself. Pinky fingers were famously supposed to stay tucked in, though historians still argue whether anyone actually followed this rule or if it was just polite fiction. Setting the cup gently on the saucer, never lifting the saucer itself to the mouth, and using just enough milk or sugar to please but not offend were all part of the subtle signaling that defined one's place in society. This attention to detail extended beyond mere manners. It became a mindful practice. The slow pace required by etiquette encouraged Victorians to sip tea deliberately rather than gulping it down, giving time for conversation and for the mind to settle. In a world growing ever more frantic with industrial machines and urban bustle, these moments of calm were precious. Interestingly, some Victorians found that observing tea etiquette helped distract from the stressors of the day. The physical actions, pouring, stirring, holding, became almost meditative, grounding the drinker in the present. You might say Victorian tea etiquette was an early form of stress management, wrapped in lace gloves and polite smiles. Of course, not all tea moments were formal. In family kitchens or among close friends, rules relaxed, and the tea could be enjoyed without the stiff posture or whispered gossip. But even here, the ritual of making and drinking tea acted as a comforting pause. You can almost hear the sighs of relief as the kettle whistles, promising a break from the relentless Victorian pace. One odd detail: some households had special tea timers, shaped like little hourglasses or mechanical devices to ensure the perfect brew time. Oversteeped tea was considered not just bitter, but a social blunder, much like arriving late to a dinner party. The obsession with timing and ritual seems almost like a Victorian attempt to control chaos through ceremony. So, while the tea itself might jangle your nerves, the etiquette surrounding it offered Victorians a reliable, soothing structure, a gentle nudge toward calm that might have done more for sleeplessness than the tea's chemistry ever could. You lift your teacup, wondering what secrets the Victorians had about caffeine tucked inside their steaming brew. The science of caffeine was in its infancy during the 19th century, and Victorian knowledge was a patchwork of observations, anecdotes, and guesses. They knew tea could invigorate the mind and body, but the precise effects and chemistry remained mysterious. Historians still argue whether Victorians fully understood how caffeine worked, or if their beliefs were mostly folklore wrapped in polite warnings. Victorians noticed that some teas energized more than others. Black teas were considered robust and stimulating, while green teas were seen as gentler. But the understanding of why this happened was vague. Some thought it was the spirit of the tea leaves. Others blamed impurities or even the way the tea was brewed. The scientific community was just beginning to isolate caffeine as a compound, but it wasn't until the late 19th century that caffeine's stimulant properties were clearly identified. In fact, Victorian doctors sometimes recommended tea to combat fatigue and nervous exhaustion, believing it boosted vitality. On the flip side, they also warned patients prone to insomnia to avoid tea late in the day. This contradictory advice shows how little was truly understood. You can imagine a Victorian physician shrugging and saying, "Tea is both friend and foe," as he handed over a teacup to a sleepless patient. Modern science now knows that caffeine blocks adenosine receptors in the brain, preventing the feelings of tiredness. But the amount of caffeine in a typical Victorian tea was likely less than your average modern espresso shot, though that didn't stop people from feeling its kick, especially when drunk in large quantities. Some scholars suggest that the ritual of tea drinking, rather than the caffeine itself, played a bigger role in relaxation and sleep preparation. A quirky Victorian detail, some teas were diluted with herbs or brewed weekly to reduce caffeine, especially for children and the elderly. This practice wasn't just about health, it also reflected class distinctions, with the poor sometimes receiving weaker brews, whether by necessity or design. So, when you sip your tea tonight, remember you're partaking in a centuries-old experiment where the science of caffeine was tangled with habit, social ritual, and guesswork. The Victorians might not have fully grasped the chemistry, but they knew enough to respect tea's double-edged power over the night.
You take a sip of your sweetened tea, and suddenly the Victorian world seems just a little cozier. Sweeteners like sugar and honey weren't just for taste, they played a subtle role in Victorian sleep culture. Sugar, which had become more affordable due to colonial trade, was a luxury that transformed tea from a bitter tonic into a soothing treat, especially in the evening when sweet flavors signaled comfort and reward. Honey, long prized for its medicinal qualities, was often added to bedtime teas for its gentle sweetness and supposed calming effects. Some Victorian homemakers believed that honey helped settle the stomach and promote restful sleep. You might imagine a mother carefully stirring a spoonful of honey into her child's chamomile tea before tucking them in, the sticky sweetness a small ritual of care. Interestingly, sweet treats like scones, biscuits, and cakes were commonly served alongside tea, especially during the cherished afternoon tea hour. These sugary morsels weren't just indulgences, they were part of a broader Victorian approach to relaxation and sleep preparation. A bit of sugar was thought to provide energy for the evening and help stave off hunger, which could otherwise disrupt sleep. Historians still argue about how much sugar affected Victorian health and sleep. While modern science links high sugar intake to restless nights and metabolic issues, the Victorians viewed it mostly as a comforting luxury. Some even believed that a small amount of sugar could soothe nerves and ease anxiety, making it a kind of natural lullaby in a cup. One quirky detail, Victorian confectioners sometimes crafted sweets specifically designed for nighttime nourishment, including gingerbread and candied fruits. These were recommended not just for their taste, but for their calming and warming properties. You could say sugar was the original comfort food long before the term existed. So, as you sip your sweetened tea tonight, remember that those little sugars and honeys are more than flavor. They're part of a centuries-old dance of taste, comfort, and the quest for peaceful sleep.
You settle into a quiet corner, pondering the delicate balance between tea as a social ritual and as a personal refuge. For Victorians, tea time was never just about the drink itself. It was a stage where social codes played out, and a moment of shared pause in an often harsh world. Yet, some Victorians preferred their tea in solitude, believing that personal quiet was the true path to relaxation and, ultimately, sleep. Social tea gatherings offered opportunities for polite conversation, gossip, and the subtle negotiations of class and gender. Women, in particular, wielded tea time as a tool for connection, networking, and sometimes gentle subversion of societal norms. The chatter over cups and saucers provided a soothing rhythm to the day, and the very act of sitting down together helped ease anxieties. It was a collective calm, like a gentle wave rolling through the drawing room. But for others, especially those sensitive to overstimulation, tea was best enjoyed alone. A private cup by the window, accompanied by a book or quiet reflection, allowed the mind to drift away from the noise of the world. These solitary tea moments became a kind of self-care, a small rebellion against the constant demands of Victorian social life. Historians still argue whether the social aspect of tea was more effective at promoting restfulness than the drink itself. The act of gathering, sharing stories, and observing ritual could induce relaxation through human connection, while solitary tea time offered meditative peace. Both approaches had their merits, depending on personality and circumstance. One quirky Victorian practice was the tea diary, where some individuals noted the time, blend, and mood associated with each tea-drinking occasion, attempting to map which rituals led to better sleep or mood. You can imagine the growing pile of notes on laps and desks, a proto-sleep tracker of sorts. So, whether surrounded by polite chatter or enveloped in quiet, tea time was as much about mental unwinding as it was about any chemical effect. The ritual, social or solitary, created a bridge from daytime stresses toward the calm needed for rest. You reach for your favorite teacup, noticing how much more than just tea was involved in the Victorian experience. There was the sensory richness, the tactile joy of the tea set itself, the clinking of porcelain, the warmth radiating through the delicate china, the gentle swirl of steam. All these details played their part in creating a soothing atmosphere, a multi-sensory lullaby for the restless mind. Victorian teapots and cups were often ornate, decorated with floral patterns, gilded edges, and sometimes even personal family crests. Handling such beautiful objects was an act of ritual reverence. The weight of the cup, the smoothness of the saucer, the faint sound of the spoon stirring, these small sensory details anchored the tea drinker in the present moment. It's no coincidence that Victorian interiors were designed to appeal to the senses, with rich fabrics, patterned wallpaper, and warm lighting enhancing comfort. Some teapots came with curious designs, double-walled for insulation, built-in strainers, or even integrated timers to ensure perfect brewing. One quirky example was the spill-proof teapot designed for carriage travel, which kept tea warm and prevented accidents during bumpy rides. You can almost hear the Victorian commuter, cramped in a horse-drawn carriage, relying on this innovation to enjoy a calm moment amid the chaos. Historians still debate how much these sensory and material aspects contributed to the calming effects attributed to tea rituals. Was it the tea itself, or the entire experience, the feel of fine china, the aroma, the quiet attention, that eased the mind? Likely, it was a combination, a holistic approach to rest long before mindfulness became a buzzword. Victorian tea parties sometimes included taste tests where guests would sample different blends and note subtle flavor differences, making the act of drinking tea a focused sensory event. This attention to detail encouraged mindfulness and slowed the pace of life, providing a gentle counterpoint to the era's industrial rush. So next time you cradle your mug, think about the legacy of Victorian tea sets, how the design, sound, and warmth all worked together to create a sensory sanctuary, helping countless souls drift gently toward sleep.
You glance sideways at your cup and wonder what other drinks the Victorians sipped when tea just wouldn't cut it for sleep. Beyond the steaming teapot, Victorian England was awash in alternative beverages and tonics, some designed to soothe, others promising a cure for just about any ailment, and some, frankly, better left forgotten. For those battling sleeplessness, warm milk was a popular option.
Sometimes sweetened with honey or a pinch of nutmeg, milk was believed to calm the nerves and ease digestion, creating a gentle lullaby for the body. There's something inherently comforting about that creamy warmth, like a liquid hug before bed. Then there were more medicinal concoctions, valerian root infusions, as mentioned earlier, and nightcaps infused with brandy or whiskey. While modern advice frowns upon alcohol as a sleep aid, many Victorians swore by a small drink before bedtime, believing it helped relax muscles and quiet the mind. Of course, historians still debate whether this practice improved sleep or just masked problems, sometimes worsening insomnia in the long run. One particularly odd tonic was beef tea, a concentrated broth made by simmering beef, used to restore strength and vitality. While it wasn't exactly a sleep remedy, it was often given to the weak and ill, including those struggling with rest. The Victorian fascination with beef tea speaks to a broader trend of blending food, drink, and medicine in one pot. Another curious drink was the herbal posset, a warm, spiced milk concoction sometimes mixed with ale or wine, thought to soothe both body and soul. Possets were considered a gentle medicine, perfect for chilly evenings when the mind and body needed calming. Of course, not all Victorian remedies were benign. Opium-laced laudanum was a common prescription for insomnia and anxiety, blurring the line between medicine and addiction. While tea itself was mostly safe, these stronger concoctions remind you that the Victorian quest for sleep was sometimes a risky business. Historians still argue how widespread the use of such tonics was among different social classes, and how much these drinks truly helped versus harmed. What's clear is that the Victorians were willing to experiment with all sorts of liquids, comforting, medicinal, and dangerous, in their search for a peaceful night. So, as you sip your tea, remember it sits in a long tradition of bedtime drinks, some wholesome, some questionable, all part of humanity's endless effort to find rest. You watch as the ladies of the Victorian household bustle about, each playing her role in the intricate tea culture that shaped not just the day, but also the rhythms of family health and rest. Women were the custodians of tea rituals, wielding quiet power in managing the household's sleep and wellness routines. Their choices, what tea to serve, when to pour it, who got which blend, had ripple effects on the family's overall peace and nightly rest. Victorian women often prepared special night teas infused with calming herbs like chamomile and lavender for children and elderly relatives. These teas were part of a larger repertoire of home remedies passed down through generations, blending tradition with the era's evolving medical knowledge. You can imagine mothers carefully steeping these blends, knowing that the ritual itself, warmth, aroma, and attentive care, was as vital as any ingredient. Moreover, women used tea time as an educational moment, teaching children about moderation, manners, and health. These lessons extended beyond the tea table, shaping daily habits that would influence sleep and well-being. The Victorian ideal of the nurturing mother linked domestic care with moral and physical health, and tea was one of her tools. On the other hand, the expectations placed on women, strict schedules, social duties, and household management could also fuel insomnia. The very rituals they maintained to soothe others sometimes became a source of their own stress. Victorian feminist scholars note that women's health struggles, including sleeplessness, were often overlooked or misunderstood, dismissed as nervousness or hysteria. One quirky tidbit, some women carried personal tea caddies, small portable containers of their favorite blends, so they could maintain their ritual even while traveling or visiting. This shows how integral tea was to their daily rhythm and, by extension, to managing their mental and physical balance. Historians still debate the extent to which Victorian tea culture empowered women in the domestic sphere versus reinforcing restrictive gender roles. What's clear is that women were both the keepers and the caretakers of tea rituals that shaped the family's approach to sleep and health. So, as you sip your tea tonight, think about the generations of women whose steady hands and thoughtful blends helped calm restless nights long before modern sleep aids. You find yourself flipping through the yellowed pages of a Victorian novel, where tea and sleep are entwined in prose as much as in real life. Writers of the era often romanticize tea rituals, portraying them as moments of tranquility amid social turmoil or emotional storm. Characters nurse teacups as they pondered dilemmas, healed from heartbreaks, or prepared for restful nights, lending literature a rich layer of cultural meaning around this humble drink. In novels by authors like Charles Dickens and the Bronte sisters, tea scenes often symbolize comfort and social connection, but also underline the fragility of Victorian nerves. A cup of tea could calm the frazzled heroine or provide a backdrop for deep conversations about anxiety and rest. This literary trope helped cement tea's reputation as a soothing, almost medicinal presence in daily life. Poetry, too, captured this mood. Poets penned verses about the quiet peace a cup of tea brought after a long day, its steam rising like gentle thoughts drifting towards sleep. The ritual became a metaphor for finding stillness, a way to bridge the noisy outside world and the silent night. But Victorian literature didn't shy away from the darker side. Insomnia was often depicted as a tormentor, and tea a double-edged sword, offering fleeting solace but sometimes prolonging wakefulness. This tension reflected broader societal anxieties about health, gender roles, and the rapid pace of change. Historians still argue how much these literary portrayals shaped public perceptions of tea and sleep versus simply reflecting existing attitudes. One quirky literary fact, some Victorian authors included detailed descriptions of tea preparation as a way to slow the narrative pace, allowing readers to settle down much like the characters. It's an early form of what we now call slow storytelling, designed to soothe the reader's mind, perhaps nudging them toward rest. So, as you cozy up tonight, remember that the tea in your hand has inspired not only bodies, but imaginations, helping countless readers find calm between the lines just as the Victorians sought calm in their cups. You step outside with a teacup in hand, surrounded by the gentle bustle of a Victorian tea garden. These outdoor spaces were more than just pretty settings. They were vital sanctuaries where the Victorians sought fresh air, nature's calm, and, hopefully, a night of better sleep. Tea gardens flourished in cities and countryside alike, offering an escape from the smoky, crowded industrial towns. The Victorian belief in the healing power of nature wasn't just poetic, it was a medical principle. Doctors prescribed time in the fresh air for nervous ailments and sleeplessness, encouraging patients to leave their stuffy rooms for gardens, parks, and promenades. Tea gardens combined the best of both worlds, soothing greenery and the comforting ritual of tea. Sipping tea amid flowers, birdsong, and gentle breezes was thought to lower stress hormones and calm the restless mind. The sensory experience, the scent of blooms mixing with tea aromas, the soft rustle of leaves, offered a multi-layered relaxation rarely found indoors. These outdoor rituals echoed earlier, more spiritual tea ceremonies from Asia, though adapted to Victorian tastes and social customs. Historians still argue how much of the tea garden's restorative power came from the environment itself versus the social rituals played out within. For some, the garden was a place of solitude and meditation. For others, a lively social scene with conversation and flirtation. Either way, it was a refuge from the era's relentless industrial noise and stress. One quirky detail: some tea gardens hosted evening moonlight teas, where lamps and lanterns created magical twilight atmospheres. These events were popular among the middle class, combining leisure with an almost mystical sense of calm. Imagine drinking your tea under flickering gaslights as the day fades, a perfect segue into night's rest. So, as you sip your tea tonight, imagine the gentle sway of leaves and distant bird calls mingling with the warmth of your cup. The Victorian tea garden may be gone, but its essence lingers, a reminder that nature and ritual together can soothe even the busiest minds. You notice that despite all the charm and calming rituals surrounding tea, there was a darker side to its relationship with Victorian sleep. Excessive tea drinking sometimes led to jitteriness, anxiety, and, yes, insomnia.
While tea was largely celebrated as a soothing companion, too much of it could turn into a sleepless tormentor. Society was well aware of this double-edged nature, and public attitudes reflected a mix of reverence and wariness. Tea addiction wasn't officially recognized as a medical condition, but anecdotes abound of individuals so reliant on their daily fix that they became nervous wrecks without it. The stimulant effects of caffeine could exacerbate the very insomnia that tea rituals sought to soothe. Some doctors warned that heavy tea consumption tended to excite the nervous system, causing restlessness and poor sleep quality. Interestingly, this awareness influenced social behaviors. Tea breaks became regulated occasions rather than free-for-alls, and some Victorian households strictly limited tea intake to certain times of the day. You might find rules like no tea after 5 p.m. or only 1 cup per hour, efforts to balance pleasure with health. Historians still debate the prevalence of tea dependence and its impact on Victorian society. Some argue it was a widespread problem among certain social classes, while others see it as an occasional issue exaggerated by moralists and temperance advocates. The narrative of tea as both cure and cause of insomnia adds a rich layer of complexity to Victorian tea culture. One quirky fact: in some circles, tea drinking was mocked as a nervous habit, and temperance movements sometimes lumped tea in with alcohol and tobacco as stimulants to be avoided for better health. It's almost amusing that tea, now often promoted as a healthful beverage, was once viewed with suspicion. So, when you enjoy your next cup, remember that the Victorians knew tea's power was potent, and that even the gentlest ritual could tip into overstimulation if not handled with care. Balance was key, even back then.
You step into a Victorian drawing room and instantly notice how tea rituals subtly marked class distinctions, influencing not just who drank tea, but how and when they did. For the aristocracy, tea time was an elaborate affair with fine china, imported blends, and strict etiquette. Meanwhile, working-class families often made do with simpler, weaker brews, or sometimes even substitutes, reflecting both economic realities and cultural differences. The upper classes enjoyed access to the best teas, often from exclusive plantations in India and Ceylon. Their tea rooms were adorned with delicate porcelain, silverware, and lace doilies, turning the act of drinking tea into an art form. For them, tea was as much a symbol of status as a comfort. The timing and social context of tea drinking, afternoon teas, evening teas, formal gatherings, reinforced social hierarchies. By contrast, working-class households typically drank small tea, a watered-down version made to stretch limited supplies. Sometimes, tea was mixed with herbs or even local leaves like blackberry or raspberry to extend the beverage and add flavor. Despite the differences, tea drinking was nearly universal, bridging social gaps while simultaneously highlighting them. Historians still argue about how much these class-based tea practices affected sleep habits. Wealthier families might afford calming blends and leisurely rituals that encouraged relaxation, while the working poor faced long hours and less restful evenings, with less access to soothing teas or quiet tea times. It's a reminder that comfort is often a privilege. One quirky note: the rise of tea shops in working-class neighborhoods introduced new social spaces where laborers could gather, rest, and enjoy a cup, blurring class lines somewhat. These shops sometimes became centers of political discussion and community solidarity. So, as you sip your tea tonight, consider how the same drink connected and divided a society, shaping not just culture, but also the rhythms of rest across Victorian England. You can almost hear the relentless clatter of factory machines in Victorian cities, a harsh soundtrack to a society caught in the whirlwind of industrialization. This rapid transformation not only reshaped landscapes, but also deeply disrupted natural sleep patterns. The rise of factories introduced rigid schedules, long working hours, and crowded living conditions, factors that compounded Victorian insomnia and heightened stress levels. In this context, tea rituals took on new significance. For many workers, a cup of tea was a brief oasis amidst the mechanical grind. Morning and afternoon tea breaks were sometimes institutionalized in factories, offering moments of respite and social connection. However, the caffeine jolt could be a double-edged sword, helping sustain energy but potentially interfering with evening rest. Industrialization also meant more artificial lighting, gas lamps, and later electric bulbs, extending work and leisure hours well into the night. This constant illumination challenged the body's natural circadian rhythms, making sleep harder to come by. The Victorians' increasing dependence on tea may have been both a symptom and a coping mechanism for these disruptions. Historians still argue how much tea rituals could offset the physiological stress of industrial life. For some, the ritualized calm of tea drinking provided mental relief. For others, it was insufficient against the physical toll of exhausting labor and noisy urban environments. One curious Victorian innovation was the development of sleeping cars on trains, recognizing the growing need for rest even during travel, a testament to how industrial progress complicated traditional rest patterns. Tea was often served in these carriages, linking transport, ritual, and the quest for sleep in unexpected ways. So, as you sip your tea tonight, remember it once stood as a fragile barrier against the grinding pace of industrial life, a small, comforting ritual amid the clatter of progress. You feel the subtle influence of Eastern traditions coursing through Victorian tea culture, though sometimes tangled in misunderstanding and adaptation. The British obsession with tea began in China, and while Victorian tea rituals bore little resemblance to the refined ceremonies of the East, they still borrowed elements of formality, mindfulness, and symbolism in ways that shaped their own unique customs. Victorian tea drinking was less about spiritual meditation and more about social performance. Yet the echoes of Asian tea philosophy can be detected in the emphasis on ritual, respect for the vessel, and the moment of quietude that tea demanded. Some Victorian collectors and travelers even brought back authentic Chinese tea sets, attempting to replicate what they imagined as a peaceful and contemplative experience. But misunderstandings abounded. The complex and subtle art of the Chinese tea ceremony was often reduced to Victorian ideals of refinement and decorum, losing much of its original meaning. Historians still debate whether Victorian tea rituals were a genuine cultural exchange or a colonial appropriation that masked deeper power dynamics. One quirky fact, Victorian magazines occasionally published how-to guides on Chinese tea ceremonies, complete with illustrations, but these often ended up as parodies or exaggerated caricatures, mixing accurate details with fanciful notions. Despite these distortions, the fascination with the East helped shape a broader Victorian interest in mindfulness, relaxation, and holistic health, concepts that would resonate with their own search for sleep remedies. Tea became a bridge between cultures, albeit an imperfect one, linking distant traditions in the shared human desire for calm. So, as you sip your tea tonight, remember that your ritual carries traces of faraway lands and ancient customs, mingled with Victorian charm and contradictions, a global quest for rest wrapped in a humble cup. You imagine a Victorian doctor carefully mixing a prescription, some recommending tea blends while others warned against them. Tea held a peculiar place in Victorian medical practice. It was both a household remedy and a subject of professional debate. Physicians prescribed specific teas to calm nerves and aid digestion, yet cautioned that overconsumption might exacerbate insomnia or nervous disorders. Doctors often advocated herbal infusions like chamomile or valerian as gentle sedatives, aligning with popular home remedies. However, opinions varied widely, and some medical texts dismissed tea's calming reputation, emphasizing instead the stimulant effects of caffeine. This contradictory advice left patients navigating a confusing landscape of medical and folk wisdom. Moreover, tea was sometimes recommended alongside other treatments: fresh air, controlled diets, and strict bedtime routines, highlighting a holistic approach to health. Victorian medicine was in transition, grappling with emerging scientific methods while still relying on centuries-old herbal knowledge. Historians still argue how much faith physicians truly placed in tea as a therapeutic agent versus its cultural symbolism. One curious detail: some doctors warned that the addition of sugar or milk to tea could affect its medicinal properties, sparking debates over the correct way to brew a healthful cup. This attention to detail shows how seriously tea's role in health was considered. So, when you sip your tea tonight, think about the many hands, both medical and domestic, that have shaped its place as a comforting, if sometimes contested, companion on the road to restful sleep. You notice the first whispers of a new idea swirling through the Victorian tea scene: the desire for decaffeinated options. While modern decaf tea wouldn't become widely available until the 20th century, early attempts to reduce caffeine content were underway, driven by growing awareness of tea's stimulating effects and the Victorian pursuit of healthful living. These early decaf teas weren't the chemically processed varieties you find today. Instead, they were often weak brews, blends mixed with calming herbs, or teas steeped briefly to minimize caffeine release. Some Victorian tea enthusiasts experimented with cold-brewed teas or used alternative leaves, seeking the comforting ritual without the sleepless side effects. This quest reflected a broader cultural shift. As medical knowledge advanced, the public became more conscious of caffeine's impact, especially among women, children, and the elderly. Demand grew for gentler beverages that still provided warmth and flavor but promised a peaceful night. Historians still debate how effective and popular these early decaffeinated teas really were. Some suggest they remained niche curiosities, overshadowed by traditional brews, while others believe they laid important groundwork for later innovations. What's clear is that Victorian tea culture was not static. It evolved with changing tastes, health concerns, and scientific discoveries. One quirky Victorian experiment involved soaking tea leaves in water and discarding the first infusion to wash away some caffeine, an early version of decaffeination through dilution. Whether it worked or was just a comforting ritual is another question. So, as you sip your tea tonight, you're partaking in a tradition that has long balanced pleasure with health, a dance between flavor and function that continues to this day. You wrap your hands around a cozy teacup, appreciating how Victorian tea accessories were more than mere tools. They were comfort objects that helped create bedtime rituals. The delicate china, embroidered cozies, and fine linens weren't just for show. They contributed to a sensory environment that soothed the mind and prepared the body for rest. Tea cozies, those quilted covers draped over teapots, kept the brew warm longer, encouraging slow sipping. This small luxury slowed down the tea-drinking experience, extending the ritual and allowing time for mental unwinding. The act of lifting the cozy, releasing a burst of steam and aroma, became a comforting moment of anticipation. Fine porcelain cups and saucers, often heirlooms passed through generations, connected drinkers to family history and tradition. The smooth touch of a well-crafted cup in hand grounded the tea ritual in tactile pleasure. Linens embroidered with delicate patterns added to the atmosphere of care and calm. Some Victorian homes featured special tea trays or portable sets, enabling tea rituals in bedrooms or sitting rooms, turning these spaces into temporary sanctuaries of peace. Even blankets or shawls were part of the ensemble, wrapping the drinker in warmth and security. Historians still debate how much these physical accessories influenced relaxation compared to the tea itself. Likely, the combined sensory experience, The warmth, texture, aroma, and visual beauty created a holistic ritual that eased the transition from busy day to restful night. One quirky detail, some tea sets included spoon warmers, small containers to heat teaspoons so that stirring didn't cool the tea too quickly, an example of Victorian dedication to perfecting every detail. So, as you cradle your mug tonight, remember that the objects surrounding your tea are part of a centuries-old tradition of comfort, ritual, and care, designed to soothe restless minds.
You glance at the price tag on your box of tea and might not realize how economics shaped who got to enjoy tea and the restful rituals tied to it in Victorian England. Tea was once a luxury only the wealthiest could afford, but by the 19th century, mass trade and colonial expansion made it accessible to many, albeit with notable class differences. Import tariffs, shipping costs, and global demand influenced tea prices, making quality and quantity a marker of social status. Wealthier households could afford the finest blends and elaborate tea services, while poorer families often relied on cheaper, weaker teas or substitutes like chicory. This disparity affected not only taste, but also the ability to partake fully in the social and health benefits of tea rituals. Access to tea also shaped sleep habits. Those who could afford calming herbal blends and the leisure to enjoy tea breaks likely had better opportunities to unwind before bed. In contrast, workers facing long hours and limited resources might have had only brief, strong cups of tea, sometimes as a stimulant to keep going rather than a means to relax. Historians still debate the extent to which economic factors influenced the health outcomes associated with tea drinking. Some suggest that disparities in access contributed to the uneven distribution of sleep quality and overall well-being across classes. One quirky economic twist, the rise of tea auctions in London created speculative markets where prices could fluctuate wildly, sometimes leading to shortages or surpluses that impacted availability. Victorian newspapers occasionally reported on tea crises that stirred public anxiety, proving tea's importance beyond mere beverage status. So, as you sip your tea tonight, consider how global trade, economics, and social privilege have long influenced who enjoys the luxury and rest that tea can bring.
You might wonder why, despite its long reign as a soothing companion, tea's role as a sleep remedy faded over time. Several factors contributed to the gradual decline of tea rituals as primary cures for insomnia in Victorian and post-Victorian society. Medical advances introduced new treatments and a better understanding of sleep disorders. Pharmaceuticals like barbiturates and later tranquilizers offered more direct relief for insomnia, making the gentle comfort of tea seem quaint or insufficient. As science progressed, tea was rebranded from a health aid to a social beverage or simple refreshment. Changing social habits played a part too. The increasing pace of life, especially in the 20th century, left less time for slow, ritualized tea breaks. The rise of coffee culture, with its quick fixes and modern appeal, also chipped away at tea's dominance. Moreover, evolving tastes and marketing shifted perceptions. Tea became associated more with afternoon socializing than with calming nighttime routines. Historians still debate whether the decline was due to genuine efficacy concerns or cultural shifts in leisure and medicine. Some argue that tea never was a true sleep remedy, but rather a comforting placebo embedded in Victorian tradition, while others see its retreat as part of broader modernization. One quirky note: early attempts at decaffeinated tea and herbal infusions never fully replaced traditional teas, partly because the ritual and taste mattered as much as the sleep promise. People missed the warmth and flavor, underscoring how tea's power lay in both body and mind. So, as you enjoy your tea now, remember you're savoring the last echoes of a centuries-old sleep tradition, one that, though faded, still whispers its calm in every warm sip. You cradle your cup, feeling the warmth spread through your hands, and realize that Victorian tea rituals have left a quiet legacy in our modern quest for restful sleep. Though the elaborate ceremonies and strict etiquette may have faded, The essence of tea as a comforting ritual remains alive, whispered in bedtime routines around the world. Today, herbal teas like chamomile, lavender, and valerian root are still popular remedies for sleeplessness, echoing Victorian blends designed to calm nerves. The modern mindfulness movement, with its emphasis on slowing down and savoring moments, mirrors the Victorian focus on ritual and sensory experience around tea drinking. Even the design of our mugs, teapots, and cozy blankets hints at the importance of comfort objects, those tactile anchors that ground us and soothe our restless minds. While we may no longer observe strict pinky etiquette or sip in drawing rooms, the core idea persists that taking time to pause, breathe, and enjoy a warm drink can be a gentle step toward peace. Historians still argue about how much Victorian tea truly helped with insomnia versus simply providing a social or psychological balm. But perhaps the real legacy isn't the tea itself, but the ritual, the intention behind the sip that lingers in our modern lives. So tonight, as you sip your tea, know that you're part of a centuries-old tradition that blends history, culture, and care. You carry forward the gentle hope that in these quiet moments, sleep will come, not just from the tea's chemistry, but from the calm it inspires. Now, slow your breath, feel the warmth fade softly, and let your mind drift away on the gentle waves of this timeless ritual. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together.